You ever notice how some places carry an ancient hush to them? Germany was like that before it was ever called Germany. It was a land of endless trees, wide rivers, and damp soil that seemed to whisper old secrets through the fog. My father used to talk about the old tribes, how they roamed deep in the Teutoburg forest, long before there were countries or flags or even roads. Back then, they didn't think of themselves as Germans. They were Chari-Cherushi Suebi, hunters, farmers, warriors. And while the Romans were building marble cities to the south, these tribes lived in wooden villages, worshipped in sacred groves, and moved with the rhythm of the land. There's something haunting about that, isn't there? A world without borders. No passports, just firelight stories passed mouth to mouth and names carved into tree bark. That's where we'll start before the kings, before the Kaisers, before the wars that tore Europe apart. Back when Germany wasn't a place on the map, just a shadow in the trees. Now, if you're still awake, let's walk into the woods together, and I'll tell you how that shadow became a nation. Rome meets the tribes, Arminius and the lost legions. I once saw a map from the days of the Roman Empire. Italy looked like the center of the universe. Roads all led outward like veins pulsing with trade armies and ambition. But there was one part just beyond the Rhine River that the Romans shaded in differently. Darker, wilder. They called it Germania, and they didn't quite trust it. You see, to the Romans, the forests of Germania were a problem they couldn't pave over. The tribes who lived there didn't build cities, didn't wear togas, and certainly didn't pay taxes to Caesar. They were too free, too fragmented, and too familiar with the trees. Rome liked order, but Germania didn't care much for rules. Around the year 9 AD, the empire thought it could fix that. They sent a man named Publius Quinctilius Varus with 3 full legions, about 20,000 men. He was told to bring Roman law and structure to the Germanic tribes. Civilize them, in other words. But Varus had no idea what was waiting for him. And here's where it gets interesting. One of the local tribal leaders, Arminius, had been trained by the Romans. He spoke Latin, wore Roman armor, even served in their cavalry. To them, he looked like a loyal ally. But he had other plans. He knew how the Romans moved, how they marched, how they trusted their formations. And he knew the forests of Germania far better than they did. That September, as the legions were making their way through the Teutoburg forest, a thick, twisting nightmare of mud and trees and fog, Arminius turned on them. His tribes launched a surprise attack that lasted for days. Not a bold frontal charge, but a series of ambushes, traps, and relentless assaults. By the time it was over, all 3 Roman legions were gone. Not defeated, erased. Their eagle standard symbols of Roman power were taken. It was one of the worst military disasters in Roman history. Now you might be thinking, okay, that's just one battle. But to Rome, it was something deeper. It was humiliation. It was the realization that maybe this wild land couldn't be tamed. After Teutoburg, they stopped trying to conquer beyond the Rhine. Germania would stay outside the empire. I remember seeing a documentary about it once late at night. The narrator said the forest still gives people chills, that even now archaeologists sometimes find Roman helmets or coins buried deep beneath the moss, like ghosts that never left. Arminius, for his part, didn't get a happy ending. His own people turned on him not long after. But in the centuries that followed, his story became something else, a kind of legend. A man who stood up to empire, a symbol of Germanic independence. The Romans had their emperors, the Greeks had their philosophers, but the Germans, they had Arminius, lurking in the trees, teaching the world that not every people could be bent into an empire. And that's where the pattern begins, Germany's long, winding relationship with outsiders. Sometimes resisting, sometimes absorbing, but always shaped by that forest memory. The idea that the land belongs to no one unless you know how to walk it quietly. It makes you wonder, doesn't it? If a place remembers, if the wind still carries the sound of clashing swords and Roman cries. I like to think it does. So tonight, as you lie there listening, picture those trees dense and towering. Picture the Romans armored and proud, marching into the mist, and picture Arminius, calm and silent, waiting in the shadows. Germany didn't start as a kingdom or a country. It started as a whisper in the woods and a roar that shattered an empire. The Holy Roman Patchwork. My grandfather once said, "The Holy Roman Empire was neither holy nor Roman, nor much of an empire." I laughed at the time, thinking he was being poetic. Later I realized he was just quoting Voltaire. But he had a point. After Rome collapsed in the West around 476 AD, Europe didn't suddenly become peaceful farmland and fairy tales. Its splintered tribes took over cities, warlords claimed titles, and out of all that chaos, something new tried to rise, a collection of kingdoms loosely tied together by the idea of empire. Fast forward a few centuries, around 800 AD, and a man named Charlemagne, or Karl der Grosse, if you prefer the German version, was crowned emperor by the Pope himself. Now that moment mattered, because it symbolized an attempt to stitch together the broken Roman dream with a Christian seal and a German sword. Charlemagne wasn't exactly German. He was Frankish, but his empire included large swaths of what is now Germany, and for a while, it felt like something solid might emerge from the ashes. He built schools, codified laws, even encouraged the use of a common script. But after his death, his empire fractured like frost-breaking glass. And what emerged over time in Central Europe was something very German, not in the modern sense, but in the sense of complexity. Dozens eventually, hundreds of duchies, principalities, city-states, bishoprics, and knightly orders, all overlapping, all squabbling, all calling themselves part of something bigger, the Holy Roman Empire. You might imagine an empire like a smooth piece of silk. But this was more like a patchwork quilt, stitched by a dozen people who didn't agree on the colors. Some areas spoke High German, others spoke Low. Some answered to local dukes, others to the Pope, others still to the emperor, who was elected by the way, not inherited. Imagine trying to govern a realm where the emperor might control one city, but not the road leading out of it, and yet somehow it worked, or at least it functioned. There were diets, formal assemblies held in cities like Worms and Regensburg. Princes gathered in grand halls to argue theology, trade routes, or who had insulted whom over dinner. There was ceremony, there was music, there was wine. But there was also conflict. The empire was Christian, yes, but not unified in its Christianity. The Pope often butted heads with the emperor, and within the borders, tensions simmered between powerful bishops and rising noble families. Cities grew wealthy and independent, sometimes more loyal to commerce than to crowns. I once read that medieval Germany was like a chessboard where every square had its own rules. That feels right. And in that chaos, something unique happened, a culture of local pride. People weren't just Germans. They were Bavarians, Saxons, Swabians, Rhinelanders. Their identity was rooted in river valleys, dialects, cathedral towers. That localism, oddly enough, gave Germany richness. The art of Nuremberg, the cathedrals of Cologne, the trading power of the Hanseatic cities, like Lübeck and Hamburg. While France and England were forging centralized monarchies, Germany was a symphony of smaller sounds, sometimes harmonious, often clashing. There's a charm to it. I remember walking through Rothenburg ob der Tauber, once a medieval town, so well preserved it feels like a painting. You can almost hear the hooves of knights echoing off the cobblestones. That town was once part of the empire. Like so many others, it had its own walls, laws, and sense of who belonged. But empires like that can't stay frozen forever. By the 1500s, cracks in the holy facade would begin to widen. A German monk would nail a piece of paper to a church door in Wittenberg, and the entire Christian world would start to shake. But we're not there yet. For now, close your eyes and picture that patchwork. Picture a land of spires and forests of toll roads and tiny kingdoms of emperors whose power was more theater than force. And yet, it all held together in its own way. Germany was not yet a nation, but it was becoming a world unto itself, a stage on which history would play out again and again, sometimes in harmony, often in discord, like a fugue written by too many hands, but beautiful nonetheless. Luther's hammer. When faith split the empire. There's a church in Wittenberg with thick wooden doors and heavy stone steps. I remember standing there once, looking up at the spot where it all supposedly began. No lightning, no thunder, just a simple piece of paper nailed to a door, if the story is to be believed. And yet, that one act cracked Europe in two. It was October 31st, 1517, when a German monk named Martin Luther posted his 95 Theses on that church door. He wasn't trying to start a war. Not really. He was calling for a debate about indulgences, about corruption, about what it really meant to be saved. But what followed was not a polite theological chat. The Holy Roman Empire, already a patchwork of loyalties and beliefs, suddenly had a new dividing line: Protestant and Catholic. Luther wasn't just a monk. He was a scholar, a preacher, and a man who knew how to speak plainly to the people. When he translated the Bible into German, it wasn't just an act of rebellion, it was a gift of understanding. Suddenly people could read Scripture for themselves. That was dangerous. Princes and city leaders began to pick sides. Some supported Luther out of conviction, others out of convenience. Breaking from the Catholic Church also meant keeping more of your tax money at home and not sending it to Rome. The emperor, at the time Charles V, wasn't pleased. He summoned Luther to the Diet of Worms in 1521. Now imagine that. A lone monk standing before the most powerful rulers in Europe, being told to recant. And Luther, calm as a stone, replied, "Here I stand. I can do no other." Whether he actually said those exact words or not doesn't even matter. The legend stuck. Luther was declared an outlaw, but he wasn't executed. Thanks to powerful allies, he disappeared into hiding at Wartburg Castle, where he continued his work. Meanwhile, across the empire, chaos began to unfold. New churches, new doctrines, and more importantly, new identities. The Peasants' War broke out just a few years later, inspired partly by Luther's words and partly by centuries of suffering. Tens of thousands of peasants rose up against their feudal lords. But Luther, ever the conservative when it came to social order, didn't support them. He called for their suppression, and thousands were killed. It was a reminder that revolutions are rarely clean. They carry hope, yes, but also blood. The empire tried to hold itself together. Treaties were signed, diets were held, and boundaries were drawn, not just on maps, but on altars and in hearts. The Peace of Augsburg in 1555 gave each prince the right to choose the religion of his territory. Cuius regio eius religio, they called it, whose realm his religion. But that was only a pause, not a solution. Underneath, tensions smoldered. Cities like Augsburg, Nuremberg, and Strasbourg tried to find middle ground, but suspicion ran deep. Neighbors who once shared pews now crossed the street to avoid each other. The Holy Roman Empire, already a tangle of flags and titles, was now a tangle of faiths. Still, it wasn't all destruction. The Reformation sparked a flowering of thought. Printing presses hummed. Pamphlets flew from town to town. Debates raged in taverns and universities. Music, art, and education all took new shapes. But the storm was coming. The 30 Years' War, one of the most devastating conflicts in European history, was just over the horizon. Tonight, though, before we get to that, I want you to imagine that church door in Wittenberg. Quiet. Still. The wood weathered the hinges cold, and a monk, just a man, tired and brave, tapping a nail into the grain. That sound still echoes. Fire and faith, the 30 Years' War. My uncle once told me, if you want to understand German history, follow the smoke. He wasn't being poetic. He meant war. And in the 1600s, the smoke never seemed to clear. The 30 Years' War began in 1618, but it wasn't just one war. It was a tangle of battles, betrayals, and broken promises, spanning 3 decades and dragging nearly every corner of the Holy Roman Empire into the mud. It started in Prague, of all places, with something called the defenestration. A fancy word, really, for throwing people out a window. Protestant nobles stormed into the castle and tossed 2 Catholic officials out into the moat. They survived, but the gesture that was enough to ignite a war. At first it was about religion, Protestant versus Catholic, Lutheran princes against Catholic Habsburgs. But as time dragged on, the lines blurred. France, a Catholic nation, joined in on the Protestant side just to weaken the Habsburgs. Sweden got involved. Spain, too. By the end, it was less about faith and more about power. Germany became the battlefield. Villages burned, crops failed, armies marched through the same lands again and again, looting, conscripting, spreading disease. Whole towns vanished. Entire regions were reduced to ash. Some historians estimate that 1/3 of the German population died during the war, millions lost to hunger, plague, and violence. I once walked through a town in Thuringia that still keeps an empty field where the old village once stood. Locals say it was never rebuilt after the war, just left to the wind. But amid the horror, there were moments of fierce resilience. Families hid bread under floorboards. Monks continued to copy texts by candlelight. Children were born. Songs were still sung. Lovers still met in secret, even when cannons echoed in the distance. And then finally, in 1648, peace. They called it the Peace of Westphalia. Delegates from across Europe met in Münster and Osnabrück to negotiate, argue, eat, drink, and after years, sign the papers. It didn't fix everything, but it changed everything. For one, it formally recognized the sovereignty of individual states within the empire. Princes could choose their own religion, their own laws. It was the beginning of the modern idea of a nation-state, but Germany was exhausted. Burned out churches, empty homes, orphaned cities, and still somehow, it endured. The empire limped on, a little more fragmented than before, a little more secular, a little more wary. But it was still an empire. Still German in that old way, messy, musical, multi-layered. Sometimes I think about the people who lived through those 30 years. What did they pray for at night? Did they ever imagine it would end? Did they remember what peace felt like tonight? If you're still awake, think of them. The farmer in Saxony planting seeds in ruined soil. The widow in Bavaria lighting a single candle for her lost sons. The child in Hesse tracing stars into the frost on the window pane. History tends to remember the kings and generals, but it was the quiet people who carried the weight. who rebuilt with bare hands, who whispered stories to keep the past alive. And so we whisper too. Baroque splendor and broken crowns. Germany in the 1700s. If the 1600s were all fire and famine, the 1700s came dressed in powdered wigs and gold leaf. Not everywhere, of course, but enough that from a distance it looked like peace had returned. After the Peace of Westphalia, the Holy Roman Empire kept existing in name, but everyone knew the seams were coming loose. Germany wasn't one country. It was more like a jigsaw puzzle shaken just enough to never quite snap back into place. Hundreds of little states, some no larger than a county fairground, each with its own prince, its own army, its own anthem played on slightly out-of-tune harpsichords. And yet, there was beauty. The Baroque age swept across the German lands like a velvet curtain, dramatic, ornamental, a little over the top. Churches were rebuilt with swirling frescoes and ceilings that seemed to reach for heaven. Palaces sprang up with gardens so symmetrical they looked drawn with a ruler from God. If you've ever stood in Würzburg's residence or walked the halls of Charlottenburg Palace, you've felt it, that strange mix of elegance and excess. But this wasn't just an age of decoration. It was also the age of ideas. In dusty university halls and candlelit studies, German thinkers began asking questions that would echo through centuries. Leibniz wondered if this was the best of all possible worlds. Kant, a bit later, would argue about what we could ever truly know. And across taverns and tea rooms, the ideas of the Enlightenment crept in freedom, reason, science, the rights of man. Now, while philosophers wrote treatises, kings still played chess with lives. One in particular, Frederick II of Prussia, better known as Frederick the Great. Prussia wasn't the biggest or richest state in the empire, but under Frederick, it became the sharpest. He modernized the army, reformed the bureaucracy, and fought wars with a strategist's cold eye. He even kept a flute by his bedside, claiming that music and war weren't so different, both required precision. Frederick's rise worried just about everyone: Austria, France, even his allies. Wars flared first, the War of Austrian Succession, then the 7 Years' War, which Winston Churchill would later call the First True World War, because it touched nearly every continent. And Germany. Well, it bled again. Armies trampled the same roads. Towns changed hands like poker chips. Treaties were signed, then broken, then redrawn. And all the while, peasants huddled in barns, hoping the next uniform through their village spoke a language they understood. But something strange happened too. Out of all this chaos, a feeling began to stir, a whisper of something called Germanness. Not nationalism, not yet, but a sense that maybe all these fractured states shared more than geography, a language, a heritage, a music that sounded like home. Ah, yes, music. This was the century of Bach and Handel, of sonatas and fugues played in candlelit chapels and echoing through stone cathedrals. If you've ever drifted off to a cello suite by Bach, you've heard the soul of 18th century Germany humming to itself. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, something else was happening. In 1776, 13 colonies declared their independence from a king. And while Germany had no direct part in America's revolution, German thinkers watched closely. So did German soldiers, some as mercenaries hired by the British. The world was shifting. Monarchs were being questioned. The old world order trembled. By the end of the 1700s, the French Revolution had exploded across Europe like a cannon blast. Kings were losing their heads, literally. And the ideas of liberty, equality, fraternity, they would not stop at the Rhine. Germany still fractured, still layered in lace, and laws stood on the edge of something new. The Baroque glitter was fading. The Enlightenment's glow had sparked something brighter and more dangerous. Tonight, as you lie there in the quiet, think of a candlelit chamber somewhere in Saxony. A scholar bending over a desk, a soldier marching through snow, a boy pressing his ear to the floorboards to hear music played below, all of them waiting for a century to end and another to begin. Napoleon's shadow. When Germany met the modern world. My grandfather once told me that Napoleon didn't just march through countries, he marched through time. He meant that the man didn't just fight battles. He redefined the world people thought they knew. And Germany felt that shadow more than most. It was the early 1800s, and the Holy Roman Empire, already old, already creaking, was about to collapse like a worn-out stage set. Napoleon's armies were sweeping across Europe, draped in revolutionary slogans and carrying bayonets sharp enough to redraw borders. In 1806, after centuries of rule, the Holy Roman Empire officially ended, just gone. With a letter of abdication from Emperor Francis II and a nod from Napoleon, the old order vanished. You could almost hear the pages of history turning. What came next wasn't a unified Germany, but it was a start. Napoleon organized the Confederation of the Rhine, grouping together dozens of German states under his protection. It was efficient, sure, but it also meant that for the first time, these states started seeing themselves as part of something larger. Maybe not a nation yet, but definitely a region with a future. And not everyone hated Napoleon. Some German intellectuals admired him. He was seen as a symbol of progress, of reason over aristocracy, merit over birthright. His Code Napoleon inspired reforms across the German states. Feudal privileges were abolished, Jews gained rights, and new civil codes took shape. But admiration has a short shelf life when boots are marching across your land. By 1812, Napoleon had grown too bold. His invasion of Russia became a disaster, and suddenly German states that once supported him turned. Prussia, ever the opportunist, rose to challenge him. So did Austria. And in 1813, at the Battle of Leipzig, also called the Battle of Nations, the tide turned. It was one of the largest battles in European history before World War I. Over 500,000 soldiers clashed, and when the smoke cleared, Napoleon was in retreat. People remember 1815 as the year of Waterloo, and rightly so. It ended Napoleon's reign for good. But for Germany, the real transformation had already begun. After Napoleon's fall, Europe tried to put the genie back in the bottle. The Congress of Vienna was like a giant diplomatic group therapy session. Noblemen and monarchs trying to restore order, draw clean lines, and pretend the revolution had been just a bad dream. What they created was the German Confederation, a loose grouping of 39 states, including Prussia and Austria, tied together by little more than paperwork and polite nods. It was less a country than a cocktail party of dukes and kings, each trying to hold on to power, while the world around them changed. But underneath that polished surface, something was rumbling. German nationalism had been awakened, not by speeches, but by war, by music, by memory. People started talking about a Germany rather than many Germanys, and not just the elites. Farmers, merchants, teachers. They began imagining a common language, a common destiny, a common home. Meanwhile, cities were changing too. The Industrial Revolution, already humming in Britain, began to flicker across the German lands. Coal, steel, railroads, factories. It wasn't just castles and cathedrals anymore. Smokestacks began reaching into the sky like strange new spires. And with the trains came people. And with people came ideas. Fast ones. Liberalism, nationalism, socialism. It was as if Germany, after centuries of fragmentation and old rituals, had been jolted awake. Tonight, as you lie in bed, Maybe picture a village in the Rhineland, a blacksmith listening to news of a new railway, a schoolteacher explaining Napoleon's fall to wide-eyed students, a widow lighting a candle beneath a faded portrait of a son lost at Leipzig. Germany had stepped into the modern age, not by choice, but by force. Napoleon's shadow had faded, but in its place was a question. What comes next? A nation begins to dream. The revolutions of 1848. My father used to say that some years are like thunderclaps, sudden, loud, and impossible to ignore. And 1848. That was one of them. All across Europe, people stood up at once as if awakened by the same dream. In France, in Italy, in Austria, and yes, in Germany too. A dream of freedom, unity, and a voice that carried beyond the palace gates. Germany in 1848 was still a patchwork quilt stitched together by language and culture, but torn by politics and power. The German Confederation, born after Napoleon's defeat, had done little to unite the people. Instead, it preserved the old order, kings, dukes, and emperors guarding their thrones like dragons. But things were changing. Factories had begun to reshape the cities. Railroads connected towns that used to feel like separate worlds. Newspapers carried ideas faster than armies ever could. And among the people, especially students, artisans, and the growing middle class, there was a hunger for something more. More rights, more say, more Germany. Then came the spark. In February 1848, revolution broke out in Paris, toppling the French king. Within weeks, the wave reached the German states. In Berlin, Vienna, Frankfurt, people poured into the streets. They waved black, red, gold flags, sang patriotic songs, and demanded constitutions, parliaments, and press freedom. It was messy, chaotic, beautiful, and for a moment it felt like anything was possible. In May of that year, representatives from across the German lands gathered in the city of Frankfurt. For the first time, Germans came together not as rival princes or feuding states, but as delegates of a people. They met in the Paulskirche, a church-turned parliament, and debated what kind of Germany should be born. Should it be a monarchy or a republic? Should Austria be part of it? What rights should citizens have? Who should rule? The debates were long, passionate, sometimes poetic. They drafted a constitution, a bold modern one, and when they finished, they offered the crown to King Friedrich Wilhelm IV of Prussia, not as a divine right, but as a gift from the people. And the king refused. He said he wouldn't accept a crown from the gutter. With that one sentence, the dream began to slip. Across the German states, the old rulers regrouped. They rolled back reforms. They sent in troops. The revolution, which had once looked like a sunrise, began to fade into twilight. By 1849, the Frankfurt Parliament was dissolved. Its leaders scattered or arrested. Some went into exile, many to America, where they would later fight for freedom in a new land. Others stayed planting seeds of reform that would grow slowly underground. And yet, the dream didn't die. You see, something had changed. The people had spoken not in whispers, but in songs, speeches, and shattered chains. They had imagined a united Germany, a democratic Germany. And once imagined, it could not be unimagined. The black, red, gold flag, born in the student protests of 1848, would disappear for a time, but it would return again and again, in war, in peace, in hope. Tonight, as your thoughts drift and your breathing softens, imagine the Paulskirche filled with candlelight. Imagine a young poet reading the new Constitution aloud, voice trembling but clear. Imagine crowds outside holding hands, believing for one precious spring that history could be rewritten from the ground up. Germany wasn't ready yet, but it had begun to dream. Blood and Iron. The Rise of Prussia and the Road to Unification. There's a certain kind of silence that comes after disappointment, the kind that settles in like fog. After the failed revolutions of 1848, that silence hung over the German states. The dreams of unity and freedom had been tucked back into drawers. But in the north, in the cold, disciplined corridors of Berlin, something else was stirring. Prussia. If Austria was the old heart of the German Confederation, Prussia was its muscle modern, efficient, and quietly ambitious. And in 1862, a man stepped forward who would change everything. Otto von Bismarck. I remember seeing an old photograph of him in my high school textbook, broad-shouldered, stern eyes, and that unmistakable mustache. But Bismarck wasn't just a man of posture. He was a man of calculation, of cold strategy, and above all, of results. In one of his first speeches as Prime Minister of Prussia, he laid it out plainly, not by speeches and majority decisions, but by blood and iron. It wasn't subtle, but it was effective. Bismarck believed that Germany wouldn't unite through poetry or parliaments. It would take force, war, pressure. And so, he went to work. First, he reformed the Prussian military, strengthening it into one of Europe's finest. Then he found his first target, Denmark. In 1864, Prussia and Austria teamed up to fight Denmark over two small duchies, Schleswig and Holstein. It seemed like a minor conflict, but it was a test, and Prussia passed. Next, in 1866, Bismarck turned on his old ally Austria. He provoked a crisis, declared war, and in just 7 weeks crushed the Austrian forces at the Battle of Königgrätz. 7 weeks. That's how long it took to break centuries of dominance. Austria was pushed out of German affairs, and in its place, Bismarck created the North German Confederation, led by who else? Prussia. But Bismarck wasn't done. He knew that to truly unite Germany, he needed the southern states, Bavaria, Württemberg, Baden, and that would take something powerful, something emotional, something patriotic. It would take war with France. And so, in 1870, using a diplomatic cable called the Ems Dispatch, edited ever so carefully to insult the French, Bismarck baited Napoleon III into declaring war on Prussia. The plan worked perfectly. German states, now feeling threatened by a common enemy, rallied to Prussia's side. Together they marched into battle. The Franco-Prussian War had begun. It was swift and brutal. By January 1871, Prussian troops had surrounded Paris. France surrendered. Napoleon III was captured. And in a hall of mirrors at the Palace of Versailles, of all places, Germany was born. Kaiser Wilhelm II, the King of Prussia, was proclaimed Emperor of the new German Empire, not in Berlin, in Versailles. The symbolism was deliberate. France had been humiliated, and Germany had been unified not by dreams, but by blood and iron. Back home, Germans celebrated. Bells rang, flags flew. 1,000 different dialects suddenly belonged to one language. 1,000 towns now stood under one banner. But Bismarck, he didn't smile much. He knew that a country built in war would have to be held together carefully. The empire he forged wasn't just a nation. It was a balance of old monarchies, powerful industries, and rising social tensions. Still, for the first time in history, Germany was one country, one voice, and it had been a long time coming. Tonight, as you drift towards sleep, picture that mirrored hall in Versailles. Imagine the glare of gas lamps on polished glass, the echo of boots on marble, the solemn voice declaring an empire into existence. Germany had arrived, but the future that would be another matter. Empire on the rise, industry, science, and uneasy peace. You ever look at a calm river and know there's a current running strong beneath the surface? That's what Germany felt like in the decades after unification. On the outside, peace, pride, progress. But underneath something restless, a hum in the wires, a tension in the air. The new German Empire, born in 1871, wasted no time in flexing its muscles. Cities like Berlin, Hamburg, and Munich swelled with factories, chimneys, and train stations. Steel, coal, and chemicals flowed out of the Rhineland. Railroads stitched the empire together like veins, pumping industry into every corner of the map. This was the age of German science and invention. Siemens, Bosch, Bayer, names we still hear today, were laying down roots. Physicists like Max Planck were beginning to whisper about strange things like quanta. And in quiet university labs, a man named Albert Einstein was just a schoolboy, scribbling thoughts in the margins of his books. There was power in that kind of momentum, but also pressure. The empire wasn't just a machine, it was a patchwork. Prussia still dominated politics, but Bavaria had its pride. Catholics in the south, Protestants in the north, old aristocrats clashing with new industrialists, urban workers demanding rights, and under all of it, Bismarck still pulling the strings. He was a master at it. To keep the peace, he introduced the world's first modern welfare state, health insurance, accident insurance, pensions, not out of kindness, but calculation. Give the people just enough, he figured, and they won't ask for more. He also played Europe like a chessboard. He formed alliances with Austria, Hungary, and Russia. He kept France isolated. He balanced war and peace like a tightrope walker, always one step ahead. But then, in 1890, everything shifted. Kaiser Wilhelm III died. His son reigned only briefly. And then came Wilhelm II, the young, brash, mustachioed emperor, who believed Germany deserved more. More colonies, more respect, more glory. He dismissed Bismarck. Let that sink in. The man who had built the empire was pushed aside by a new generation, one that didn't remember how fragile unity really was. Wilhelm II wanted a navy to rival Britain. He wanted German flags in Africa and the Pacific. He gave dramatic speeches, made bold moves, and where Bismarck had used diplomacy like a scalpel, Wilhelm swung it like a hammer. At home, nationalism surged. The idea of being German wasn't just about unity anymore. It was about destiny, greatness, empire. But not everyone was buying it. Workers were organizing. Socialists were gaining seats in parliament. Intellectuals were warning that the empire's rapid pace couldn't last forever. And the rest of Europe watching. Nervous. By the turn of the century, Germany stood tall, an industrial titan, a scientific powerhouse, a military force, but also a country teetering between confidence and overreach, between brilliance and arrogance. There's a moment just before a storm, when the sky is too quiet. The wind pauses. Birds disappear. You can feel the pressure building, even if you don't know what's coming. That's where Germany stood. Tonight, as you close your eyes, picture a bustling Berlin street, around 1900 electric lights, glowing newspapers fluttering, factory whistles echoing in the dusk, children running, horses clattering on cobblestones, and behind it all, that hum. Germany was rising, but so was the storm. Into the fire, Germany and the First World War. It started with an assassination, a gunshot on a summer morning in Sarajevo, 1914. A young man pulled the trigger and the world caught fire. Now most Germans had never heard of Archduke Franz Ferdinand, let alone the tangled web of Balkan alliances. But within weeks, their country was marching to war. Trains full of young men waving from windows, flowers tossed in their laps, off to fight for the fatherland. They said the war would be over by Christmas. It wasn't. Germany stood with Austria-Hungary, opposed by Russia, France, and eventually Britain. The Schlieffen Plan. Germany's bold strategy to knock out France quickly brought German troops sweeping through Belgium. That move brought Britain into the fight, and soon trenches stretched across Europe like scars. The war became a stalemate. Mud, barbed wire, shell fire. The Western Front froze in place, while on the Eastern Front, Germany pushed back the Russians with brutal efficiency. Victories came, but at a staggering cost. At home, the Kaiser urged unity. Propaganda filled the streets. Rations tightened. Women worked in munitions factories. Children collected metal. Everyone was told to do their part. But morale slipped. People grew tired of hunger, of loss, of hope fading. Then, in 1917, America entered the war. It wasn't just the sinking of the Lusitania or intercepted telegrams. It was the sense that Germany had become the aggressor, that the empire built on blood and iron was now threatening the balance of the world. By 1918, Germany was exhausted. The spring offensive, one last desperate push on the Western Front, gained ground, but couldn't hold it. The Allies counterattacked, and German lines crumbled. At home, protests erupted. Soldiers mutinied. The Navy refused to sail. Cities swelled with strikes and revolution, and in November 1918, the Kaiser abdicated. Germany became a republic, and the war ended. But peace came at a price. In 1919, the Treaty of Versailles carved that price in stone. Germany was blamed for the war, forced to pay massive reparations, stripped of colonies, military reduced, humiliated. The signing took place in the same Hall of Mirrors where Germany had once been born. Now it was being humbled under the same chandeliers, in front of the same mirrors, but with very different eyes watching. Back home, people were stunned, angry. Some said the army hadn't lost the war, the politicians had stabbed them in the back. That myth would haunt Germany for years. The Weimar Republic, as the new government was called, had been born in defeat. And though it brought democracy, art, and a few golden years, it also inherited the trauma of war. Tonight, as you rest your head, imagine those quiet streets of post-war Berlin. The parades were gone. Flags hung limp. Families gathered around radios waiting for news. Bread lines stretched longer than ever. And somewhere in that uneasy silence, new voices were beginning to rise. Germany had survived the fire, but the embers still burned. Weimar shadows art chaos and the seeds of extremism. Germany after the Great War was like a man waking up from a long, feverish dream, drenched in sweat, heart pounding, unsure what was real anymore. The empire was gone. The Kaiser was in exile, and in its place stood something new, fragile, hopeful, and already haunted. They called it the Weimar Republic. It was born in 1919 in the small city of Weimar, because Berlin was too dangerous for politicians to meet. A constitution was written. Freedoms were promised. Democracy for the first time had come to Germany, but it didn't arrive quietly. The early years were chaos. Revolution from the left, coups from the right, street fights between communists and monarchists, armed militias parading through neighborhoods. It felt like the country was being pulled in every direction, at once torn between its past and an uncertain future. Inflation hit like a storm. By 1923, the German mark was so worthless that people carried wheelbarrows of cash just to buy bread. Children made kites from banknotes. Restaurants changed their prices by the hour. It wasn't just economic collapse, it was humiliation, stacked on top of defeat. And yet, amid the disorder, there was brilliance. Berlin became a laboratory for the modern age. Painters like George Gross and Otto Dix captured the grotesque energy of the streets. Writers like Bertolt Brecht and Thomas Mann asked hard questions about truth, power, and identity. Cabarets pulsed with jazz and satire. Women wore bobbed hair and spoke their minds. Some called it decadent, others called it freedom. Technology surged. Radios entered homes. Cars rolled off assembly lines. The Bauhaus movement reimagined design, stripping it down to clean lines and pure function. Germany was rebuilding not just its cities, but its soul. But not everyone celebrated. Many Germans saw the Weimar years as a betrayal. They blamed the Republic for the defeat in war, for the treaty, for the inflation, for the shame. The far left wanted revolution. The far right wanted revenge. And somewhere in that fractured middle, new dangers were gathering. One of them had been a corporal in the trenches, a failed artist, a man who spoke with fire and promised order in a time of chaos. His name was Adolf Hitler. In 1923, he led a failed coup in Munich, the so-called Beer Hall Putsch. He was arrested, sent to prison, and most of Germany dismissed him as a fringe extremist. But prison gave him time to write, to plan, to sharpen his message. He would be back. By the late 1920s, things seemed to stabilize. The economy recovered, helped by American loans. The arts flourished. Germany was invited back onto the world stage. There was even a moment, a golden stretch between 1924 and 1929, when it looked like Weimar might actually work. But it was fragile. And then in 1929, the stock market crashed in New York, and the world fell with it. Tonight, as you settle into sleep, picture Berlin in the twilight of the 1920s. The cafes alive with poetry, the newspapers stacked with bold headlines, a jazz trumpet echoing down a cobbled street. And in a dim apartment, a man at a desk, scribbling in a book, convinced that Germany's fall was not the end, but the beginning of something far darker. The Weimar Republic had given Germany a chance at light, but shadows were growing. The rise of the Nazis, from fringe to power. You ever watch a storm roll in from far away? First, it's just a darker patch on the horizon. Then the wind picks up, the birds go quiet, and before you know it, the sky is roaring. That was Germany in the early 1930s. The Wall Street crash of 1929 hit like a hammer. German banks collapsed. Businesses shuttered. Millions lost their jobs. Once again, people lined up for bread, clutching ration cards, staring at empty shelves. The wounds of the Great War had never really healed, and now they were bleeding again. In the middle of that despair, a voice grew louder. It was sharp, angry, confident. A voice that said, "Germany has been betrayed. I will restore her honor." Adolf Hitler had been biding his time. After the failed putsch in 1923, he rebranded the Nazi Party, not just as a gang of angry men in beer halls, but as a disciplined movement. Flags, uniforms, slogans, marches through the streets. A promise to bring Germany back to greatness. And in 1930, with the world unraveling, voters started listening. The Nazis weren't the only ones running for office. The Reichstag, Germany's parliament, was fractured. Dozens of parties, each pulling in a different direction. No one could hold a majority. No one could fix the crisis. But Hitler. He offered simplicity. Blame the treaty, blame the communists, blame the Jews. In 1932, Hitler ran for president. He lost to Paul von Hindenburg, the aging war hero. But he came close, too close, and his party gained seats. Fast. That same year, the Nazis became the largest party in the Reichstag. Still, Hitler wasn't in power yet. Hindenburg and his advisors were hesitant. They saw Hitler as uncouth, dangerous, a man to be used perhaps, but not trusted. But the political chaos deepened. Governments formed and collapsed within months. Riots broke out. The communists grew stronger. And so on January 30, 1933, Hindenburg made a fateful decision. He appointed Hitler Chancellor of Germany. Some thought it would tame him, that the office would soften his edges, that once inside the government, he could be managed, controlled. They were wrong. Within weeks, the Reichstag building was in flames. The Nazis blamed the communists. Emergency powers were granted, civil liberties suspended, opponents arrested, newspapers censored, trade unions crushed. By March, Hitler had passed the Enabling Act, giving him the power to rule by decree. Democracy didn't fall overnight. It fell in applause, in fear, in silence. Soon after, political parties were banned. State governments dissolved. Hitler became Führer, the undisputed leader of Germany. He combined the roles of president and chancellor, swore loyalty from the military, and promised a new Germany reborn from humiliation and ready to rise. The swastika flew over government buildings. Children wore uniforms. History books were rewritten. Dissent vanished. But the economy, it improved. Roads were built. Jobs returned. Industry revived. Many Germans cheered. They saw the flags, the order, the strength, and believed things were finally turning around. They didn't yet see what was coming. Tonight, as you close your eyes, imagine a family in a Berlin apartment, hanging a new portrait on the wall, not of a Kaiser, but of a man with a mustache and piercing eyes. Outside, the streets are clean. The trains run on time. The future looks bright. But behind the curtains, fear is whispering. And the storm is just beginning. Under the swastika life in Nazi Germany. Some mornings everything looks orderly from the outside. Fresh paint, clean windows, neighbors smiling politely. But if you lean in close, if you press your ear to the wall, you start to hear what no one's saying out loud. That was Germany in the mid-1930s. By now, Adolf Hitler was no longer just chancellor. He was the Führer leader of the Third Reich. The old democratic institutions had been hollowed out. The press was censored. Political opponents had vanished into exile if they were lucky, into prisons or camps if they weren't. But on the surface, many Germans felt proud. The economy had recovered. Highways stretched across the country. Radios played marching songs and patriotic speeches. The Olympics came to Berlin in 1936, and Germany dazzled the world with precision and spectacle. Tourists went home impressed. They saw order, not oppression. But there was another side to it all. Jews were stripped of rights, first in courtrooms, then in schools, then in daily life. The Nuremberg laws of 1935 declared that Jews weren't citizens. They couldn't marry Aryans. They couldn't work in certain professions. They couldn't be protected by the same laws. It didn't happen in one day. It happened like shadows, lengthening at dusk, slowly, quietly, until the whole landscape looked different. Children joined the Hitler Youth. They sang songs about loyalty and sacrifice. They learned to report disloyalty, even in their own homes. A boy might come home, hang up his coat, and casually mention to his teacher the joke his father made at dinner. And just like that, a knock on the door might come at midnight. Churches faced pressure too. Some pastors resisted, others compromised. A few embraced the new regime. The Nazi state didn't want faith. It wanted loyalty. Loyalty that was absolute, personal, unquestioning. And yet many citizens tried to carry on. They went to work. They gardened. They hosted Sunday dinners. Not everyone marched with a flag, but not everyone asked questions either. Fear has a way of shrinking your world. And then came Austria. In 1938, Hitler annexed his native country in what was called the Anschluss. There was no war, no resistance. Crowds cheered. Flowers were thrown. It was presented as unity, Germans joining Germans. But behind that celebration was another tightening of the grip. That same year, a German diplomat was killed in Paris. The Nazis used it as a pretext, and on November 9, 1938, the country erupted. Kristallnacht, the night of broken glass. Jewish businesses were smashed, synagogues burned, thousands arrested. The world watched and did little. And for Jews still in Germany, it became clear this was no passing storm. This was a new weather. As night falls and you drift towards sleep, imagine walking through a quiet German village. The bakery is closed. The teacher no longer waves from his porch. The tailor's shop has new owners. The old names are gone from the signs. The street is tidy. The flower beds neat. But the silence, it is not peace. It is fear. The march to war, Czechoslovakia, Poland, and the breaking point. You ever feel a room go quiet, not because someone stopped talking, but because everyone suddenly knew what was coming? That was Europe in 1938. After years of building up his power at home, Hitler started looking outward. He called it unification, restoration, a bringing together of German-speaking people. But each move felt more like a test, a step closer to something everyone feared, but no one dared name. First was Austria. It had gone quietly. Then came Czechoslovakia. The Sudetenland was a border region of Czechoslovakia with a large German-speaking population. Hitler claimed they were being mistreated, oppressed by the Czech government. He demanded the territory be handed over to Germany. Tensions soared. War seemed possible. Britain and France began to prepare. But they weren't ready. Not after the horrors of the Great War. Not again. So they chose a different path. Appeasement. In September 1938, British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain flew to Munich to meet Hitler. There, along with France and Italy, they signed the Munich Agreement. Czechoslovakia wasn't invited. The deal gave Hitler the Sudetenland in exchange for a promise: no more territorial demands. Chamberlain returned to London waving a paper and declaring peace for our time. But the ink was barely dry when Hitler broke his word. By March 1939, German troops rolled into the rest of Czechoslovakia. No pretense of protecting German minorities now. This was conquest, pure and simple. That's when the world finally started to see him, clearly not as a statesman with grievances, but as a gambler, pushing until someone pushed back. And next, on his list, Poland. Germany began demanding the return of Danzig, a port city that had been separated from Germany after World War I. Hitler also wanted access to the Polish corridor land that split mainland Germany from East Prussia. But this time, Britain and France drew a line. They signed guarantees with Poland. If Germany invaded, they would declare war. Still behind the scenes, Hitler had a secret plan. In August 1939, Germany signed a non-aggression pact with the Soviet Union, its old ideological enemy. It shocked the world. But the deal wasn't just about avoiding conflict with Russia. It had a hidden clause. The two powers agreed to carve up Poland. On September 1, 1939, German tanks rolled across the Polish border. Blitzkrieg lightning war had begun. Planes screamed overhead. Troops surged forward with terrifying speed. Within days, Poland was overwhelmed. On September 3rd, Britain and France declared war. World War II had begun. But in Berlin, the mood wasn't panic. It was triumph. Crowds cheered. Newspapers declared victory after victory. Hitler stood on balconies, smiling beneath the swastika. Yet behind that smile was something darker. Something that would soon consume the continent. And tonight, as you lie in the quiet of your room, picture a map on an old-school wall. The kind with lines you used to trace with your finger. And imagine one by one those lines beginning to disappear. Because borders were being redrawn, not with pens, but with tanks. and the world would never be the same again. A world at war. Germany's early victories and the fall of France. You ever play a game where one side seems to win every turn so fast, you start to wonder if the rules even apply anymore? That was Germany in the early months of World War II. After invading Poland in September 1939, Hitler paused briefly. This wasn't like the drawn-out trench warfare of 1914. This was something else. The world called it the phony war, a strange stretch when Britain and France had declared war, but didn't yet fight. People waited, watched, but nothing happened. Then, in April 1940, Germany moved again, this time to the north. First Denmark, then Norway. Both were swept up in days. German paratroopers fell from the skies. Warships slid through fjords. It was quick, efficient, and terrifying. But that was just the beginning. In May 1940, the real hammer fell. Germany launched a massive offensive through the Low Countries, Belgium, the Netherlands, and Luxembourg. The Allies had expected a replay of World War I, with a push through Belgium and a stalemate in the trenches. But Hitler had a different plan. He sent a fake attack toward Belgium to draw Allied forces there, while the real strike came through the Ardennes, a dense forest the Allies thought was impassable for tanks. They were wrong. German panzer divisions roared through the trees, crossed rivers, and emerged behind enemy lines. The French line collapsed. Within weeks, German forces were in Paris. The French government fled south. On June 14, 1940, German troops marched under the Eiffel Tower, and a few days later, France surrendered. It had taken just 6 weeks. France, the proud, battle-hardened nation of Verdun, had fallen. And the world blinked in disbelief. Back in Berlin, the mood was euphoric. Hitler toured Paris, briefly standing before landmarks that once symbolized European power. German newspapers boasted of destiny, of supremacy, of empire, but not everyone was cheering. Across the English Channel, Britain stood alone. Winston Churchill had become Prime Minister, and he wasn't interested in surrender. He rallied his country with words carved in steel. "We shall fight on the beaches," he said. "We shall never surrender." Hitler believed Britain would negotiate, but Churchill didn't flinch. So Hitler prepared for invasion. It was called Operation Sea Lion. But first, he needed control of the skies. And that's when the Battle of Britain began. German bombers filled the air. The Luftwaffe attacked airfields, radar stations, and cities. But British pilots, many barely out of their teens, fought back with relentless courage. The RAF held the line day after day. And when the smoke cleared, Britain still stood. It was Hitler's first major failure. And something shifted. The war was no longer one of quick victories and smooth parades. It was about to become a long, grinding struggle. And as you lie back tonight, maybe picture a radio in a quiet London home. A family huddled together, listening to Churchill's voice echo through the static. Beyond their window, the blackout curtains were drawn. The street was dark. But inside there was light. Because while Germany had won the opening rounds, the fight was far from over. The Eastern Gamble. Hitler invades the Soviet Union. You ever watch someone win so much so quickly that they start believing they're invincible? By 1941, that was Hitler. France had fallen. Britain stood alone, but battered. Most of Europe now lived under German boots, and Hitler, full of confidence, turned east, toward the one place that had always haunted German dreams and fears alike: Russia. Well, officially, it was the Soviet Union now, a communist superstate under Joseph Stalin, a man as ruthless as he was secretive. Germany and the USSR had signed a non-aggression pact just 2 years earlier, but Hitler had never seen it as more than a pause, a delay, a trick. He wanted land, resources, Lebensraum, as he called it, living space for the German people. And more than anything, he wanted to destroy communism. So, he launched Operation Barbarossa. On June 22, 1941, over 3 million German troops crossed the Soviet border in the largest invasion in human history. Thousands of tanks, planes, and artillery rumbled east. The surprise was total. Soviet forces were caught off guard. Entire divisions collapsed. Airfields were destroyed before a single Soviet plane could take off. It was a blitzkrieg like the world had never seen. In just weeks, the German army pushed deep into Soviet territory. Cities fell: Minsk, Smolensk, Kiev. Millions of Soviet soldiers were captured or killed. Villages burned, farmland scorched. And at first it looked like another easy victory. But then, the land began to stretch. The supply lines grew thin. Roads turned to mud. And the Soviet resistance hardened. What Hitler had called a rotting house didn't collapse. It fought back with fury. By autumn, German troops reached the gates of Moscow. But the city held. Then winter came, and it was brutal. Temperatures dropped below -40. German tanks froze. Oil turned to jelly. Soldiers wrapped their feet in newspapers. They had no proper winter uniforms, because Hitler had assumed the war would be over before the snow. But it wasn't. The Soviets launched a fierce counteroffensive. Fresh troops arrived from Siberia. The Red Army pushed the Germans back from Moscow. It was the first time the Nazi war machine had truly stumbled, and it was a turning point. Hitler had gambled everything and lost the element of speed. Now he faced a war on two fronts: the British in the west, the Soviets in the east. And worse, he had awakened a bear that would never forget. Back home in Germany, the news was still painted with glory. Victories were announced. Setbacks were minimized. But among the generals, among the soldiers freezing on the steppe, doubts began to spread. This wasn't going to end quickly. And as you settle in tonight, picture that endless Russian plain. Flat as far as the eye can see. Covered in snow. A line of soldiers marching through a storm, their breath frozen in the air. They thought they'd be home by Christmas. Instead, they would be buried beneath that snow. The tide turns. D-Day bombs, and Berlin. You ever feel a storm change direction? Like 1 minute the wind is at your back, and the next it's in your face. That's what 1944 felt like for Germany. For years, the Nazi war machine had marched across Europe with terrifying force. But by now, the momentum was shifting. Slowly at first, then all at once. On the Eastern Front, the Soviets were pushing back hard. They'd survived the winter of 1941. They'd held Moscow. Then they turned the tide at Stalingrad in 1943, a brutal, house-by-house bloodbath that ended with the surrender of an entire German army. Over 90,000 soldiers marched into Soviet captivity. Only a fraction ever came home. And while that was happening in the East, something was brewing in the West. In England, Allied forces, Americans, British, Canadians, had been planning the largest amphibious invasion in history. The code name was Operation Overlord, but we know it better as D-Day. On the morning of June 6, 1944, thousands of ships crossed the English Channel. Paratroopers dropped from the sky. Soldiers stormed beaches with names like Omaha, Utah Gold. It was chaos. Bullets ripped through the air. Sand turned red. But they kept coming. And by nightfall, they were in. The Allies had landed in France. From there it moved fast. Paris was liberated in August. The Germans fought fiercely, but they were stretched too thin. Bombs rained down on German cities. Day after day, night after night. Factories were flattened. Rail lines destroyed. Entire neighborhoods turned to ash. And still, Hitler refused to quit. He launched one last counterattack in the West, the Battle of the Bulge in December 1944, a surprise offensive through the Ardennes forest. For a few days it worked. American lines bent, nearly broke, but they held, and that was it. By early 1945, the Allies were closing in from both sides. Soviet troops were racing toward Berlin from the east. Americans and British pushed in from the west. Germany was caught in a vice. Inside Berlin, things unraveled. The city was a ruin. Hitler had retreated to his underground bunker, isolated and paranoid. He blamed his generals. He blamed the world. But deep down, he must have known. It was over. On April 30th, 1945, as Soviet troops fought street by street into the capital, Hitler took his own life. A week later, on May 7th, Germany surrendered. The Third Reich, supposed to last 1,000 years, had lasted just 12. And when it ended, it left behind a trail of devastation unlike anything the world had ever seen. Cities burned, millions dead, a continent in ruins. But even that wasn't the full horror, because as the Allies moved through liberated territory, they uncovered something else, something darker. Concentration camps, Auschwitz, Dachau, Bergen-Belsen, places where men, women, and children, Jews, Roma, political prisoners, had been worked, starved, and gassed to death. The full scale of the Holocaust emerged. 6 million Jews murdered, along with millions of others. It wasn't just a war, it was a crime against humanity, and Germany would carry the weight of that for generations. As you close your eyes tonight, imagine the streets of Berlin in May 1945. Smoke still rising, flags torn down, soldiers weeping in silence. The war was over, but the story of Germany was far from finished. Divided and rebuilt, East Germany, West Germany, and the Cold War. You ever try to glue something back together and realize it'll never quite fit the same? That was Germany after World War II. The war had ended in flames. Berlin was rubble. Millions were dead. And the Allies, America, Britain, France, and the Soviet Union, now faced the impossible task of rebuilding what was left. But unity didn't last long. See, the world had changed. A new kind of tension filled the air, not with bombs and tanks, but with spies' walls and ideologies. The Cold War had begun, and Germany, it was the front line. At first, the Allies divided the country into 4 zones of occupation, each controlled by one of the major powers. Berlin, too, was split even though it sat deep inside the Soviet zone. But the cracks were quick to show. In the West, the Americans, British, and French pushed for economic recovery. They introduced a new currency. They wanted to rebuild. In the East, the Soviets stripped factories, took reparations, and clamped down hard. They didn't want a strong Germany again, especially not one friendly with the West. By 1949, the divide was official. 2 Germanys. West Germany, the Federal Republic of Germany, democratic capitalist, and aligned with NATO. East Germany, the German Democratic Republic, communist, controlled by the Soviet Union, and part of the Eastern Bloc. It wasn't just political, it was personal. Families were split, phone calls were monitored, letters censored, and in Berlin, things got especially tense. People in East Berlin could still walk across town into the West, and many did. Doctors, teachers, engineers. Thousands fled week by week, searching for freedom, opportunity, or simply a new start. The East German government called it brain drain, and in 1961, they built a wall to stop it. Literally, concrete, barbed wire, watchtowers, the Berlin Wall. Overnight, neighbors were cut off, relatives stranded, entire streets split in 2. And for nearly 3 decades, that wall stood not just as a physical barrier, but as a symbol of a divided world. Life in East Germany was tightly controlled. The secret police, the Stasi, had files on everyone. People whispered in kitchens, wary of who might be listening. Food was rationed. Censorship was strict. But there was also stability, education, full employment, a different kind of order. In the West, things moved faster. The Wirtschaftswunder. The economic miracle swept across West Germany in the 1950s and 60s. New cars, new homes, new jobs. The country rebuilt with astonishing speed. It became a founding member of the European Economic Community. It found its place in the new Western order. But the past wasn't forgotten. Trials were held. War criminals sentenced. Germany reckoned with shame, with guilt, with responsibility. In schools, kids were taught the truth. Memorials rose. Survivors spoke. And while East and West moved in opposite directions, the weight of what had happened still hung in the air. Then one day, the wall came down. But we'll save that part for later. For now, close your eyes and picture Berlin 1970, a city divided. Neon lights flickering in the west. Quiet streets patrolled in the east. A wall between them. Families on either side. Waiting, hoping. And somewhere a child drawing on a fogged-up window, wondering what's on the other side. Reunification and reckoning Germany in the modern world. You remember where you were the first time something big ended, like a chapter closing not just in a book but in real life. For a lot of people that moment was November 9th, 1989. The night the Berlin Wall fell, crowds gathered on both sides. Some climbed the wall, others hammered it piece by piece. Soldiers watched but didn't stop them. And for the first time in decades, families embraced. Friends reunited. Streets that had been cut off were whole again. By 1990, East and West were one country again. A reunified Germany. But reunification wasn't easy. The East had to catch up economically, politically, emotionally. There were struggles, disappointments, hard conversations. And still Germany moved forward. It became a leader in the European Union. It welcomed waves of immigrants. It debated its past, taught it in schools, built memorials, in stone and silence. It remained haunted, yes, but also determined to be better. And through it all, the country never forgot what it had been. A forest of tribes, a holy Roman Empire, a land of poets and composers, a kingdom of iron and blood, a republic, a fascist dictatorship, a divided nation, a democracy reborn. It's strange to think how many versions of Germany have lived and died on the same soil. And maybe that's the real story. Not just one rise and fall, but the persistence, the reckoning, the rebuilding. Germany didn't just survive history, it carries it. And now, if you're still awake, maybe you feel it too, that long memory of a place becoming itself. Thanks for listening. Sleep well. We'll tell another story soon.